Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about Spiral Dynamics Stage Turquoise. I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics of this stage, how it differs from Spiral Dynamics Stage Yellow, and we're going to also talk about the difficulties when it comes to describing this stage, discussing its characteristics, and so on. This is a Deep Psychology podcast. I'm your host, Ross Edwards, writer, meditation teacher, founder of deep-psychology.com, and avid lover of all things psychological. In listening to this podcast, you're part of the worldwide deep psychology community of tens of thousands of people undertaking profound personal transformation. You can join us on any of the major podcasting platforms and make sure to visit the site deep-psychology.com for lots of high quality resources. Let's get started. So before we begin, I want to make a few warnings here to you, and I'm going to sort of discuss my approach to this. I'm going to discuss some of the problems we have in understanding Spiral Dynamics Stage Turquoise. So let's get into that right now. First of all, I think it's really important to say that we barely know what turquoise is. And I mean that in terms of research. Researchers don't really agree that on the characteristics of turquoise. Sometimes they don't even agree that it exists. Sometimes their research doesn't even include turquoise. So I want you to remember as you're listening to this is we don't really have clear answers in terms of the research. We don't really know. This is where the research starts to break down. So unlike really all stages before that, where we have a good idea of what it looks like in people. We know what to look for when we're looking for these stages. We know what to look for in society and in culture. How are these stages expressed collectively? We don't really know with turquoise. I mean, we do to some degree, but really with not as much certainty as the other stages. One thing I will say, however, is there seems to be good evidence for stages beyond yellow. Many researchers have found stages beyond yellow, like even stages beyond the stage that is yellow in their model, like the analog of yellow in their model has stages beyond it. There is good evidence for third tier. So what I mean by third tier, which isn't a spiral dynamics thing, it's actually a Ken Wilber thing. What third tier is spiritual stages of consciousness. We're going to get onto that, what that means. And there is evidence for stages between yellow and third tier, or, well, I mean to say one stage. There is evidence that there is a stage between yellow and third tier. And if there is indeed a stage, that would be turquoise. That's what we would call turquoise. However, the research really is very sparse. In my mind, from what I know, from what the researchers I've studied, only Suzanne Cook-Greuter, Claire Graves, and Spiral Dynamics have even talked about it. And though their findings are still tentative. I actually think Suzanne Cook-Greuter is the one who speaks at most length and with most authority on what turquoise is from a research point of view. It's interesting because stage turquoise is an advanced stage of consciousness. You know, we're talking in terms of the spiral dynamics model, it's the eighth system. Because it's such an advanced stage, researchers themselves often don't really understand it from within. You know, even if they've researched it, it doesn't mean they understand what it actually is to live at that perspective. So they may kind of misinterpret it, they may overlook it, they may dismiss it, they may understand it to be a stage that it isn't. So they might understand certain green characteristics to be turquoise, or they might understand yellow characteristics to be turquoise, or even, you know, the earlier stages, they might misunderstand them to be turquoise because they're trying to frame certain characteristics in terms of these levels, and they might get it wrong. So we have to take into that all of that into account. And even, for example, Claire Graves, who did actually speak about it in a little bit of length in his book, The Never-Ending Quest, which I highly recommend, he actually only had, I think it was 6 participants in all of his studies, in all of the years he was studying this stuff, which was, to my mind, I think it was about 30 years or something he spent studying this. Only 6 of his subjects ever started to see the world, to think, to relate in a way that was beyond his version of yellow. So 6 people, it's not really much to go on. I mean, it's, you could make some tentative conclusions, but there's nothing really solid there. Interestingly enough, as well, I'm a big follower of Ken Wilber. I've read, I don't know how many Wilber books I've read, 6 or 8 or 10, something along those lines. And even he does not talk really about turquoise as a separate stage. He sort of alludes to it here and there, but he doesn't set it out in a very sort of formal, considered, rigorous way as he does with the other stages over and over and over again. I'm not really sure why. If you are Ken Wilber, I'd like to know why that is. Maybe he doesn't really believe it exists. Maybe he doesn't know what it is. Maybe he just doesn't think it's important. But he actually even he talks about the third tier levels, which in his own model are beyond turquoise, in more detail than turquoise. So I'm not. I just. I'm not sure about why that is. There could be many explanations. I just think it's a good thing to keep in mind as we're talking here. Some claim that it doesn't even exist, that turquoise isn't even a stage. And I understand why, and I'll explain why. So we are taking all that into account, like the problems with the research, the lack of research, the conflict, the sort of theoretical problems. We're just, it'd be good to hold this, to explore it a bit, but also just to realize that we don't want to cling to this idea of stage turquoise, because who knows? It might not be what we think it is. It might not even exist. At the end of the day, what are we doing here? We're trying to understand things conceptually. Only really by living post yellow, by going beyond yellow in your own life, are you going to understand what it actually is. The same goes with any stage, but particularly with this one, where theoretically we don't really know what it is. You're likely to never have met a turquoise person in your life. So, orange people, you've definitely met them. You've probably been orange yourself if you're watching this. Green people, you've most likely met them, or you see it on the news. You sort of hear about green stuff. Yellow, I'm quite skeptical if I've ever met a yellow person in my life. Maybe that's just because of where I spend my time. Maybe I need to get out more. I don't know, but it's very rare to me. And turquoise it's got to be rarer than yellow. It's a higher stage of development. It's one that's even more underdeveloped in a cultural sense than yellow is. Mm, if you've met a turquoise person and you're convinced you have, then let me know. But I doubt I have. I really doubt it. And um, that's the point, is that it's very rare. And it's important to keep that in mind. People often talk very sloppily about turquoise, and they smudge things together. We'll talk about exactly what I mean by that. But it's easy when you start looking for stage turquoise, you might think you've seen it. But if you think you're seeing it everywhere, it's probably not stage turquoise, because it's a very rare stage. Um, we'll get on to what I mean by that in a minute or so here. I just want to say as well that on a personal level, like another warning, on a personal level, I'm really not certain about it. Like, I find it easy to understand green because I feel like I've been through like the very strong phase of green. I can also see it in myself. I've read a lot about it. I've seen it in other people, and I see it in other people all the time, constantly. I see it around me. I live near. I don't live in a city, but I live near one of the European capitals. So I'm exposed to green a lot. For example, same with orange. Yellow, less, like a lot less. I think I understand yellow quite well, but I don't see it in many other people. Uh, and sometimes I doubt whether I'm really yellow or not. With turquoise, I'm really not sure, again, if I've ever seen it in anyone else, and I'm not sure I embody it. And I'm not even sure I truly understand what it is because I've never seen it in the world. You know, it'd be kind of like reading about an animal in a book and seeing the photos and so on, but until you actually see it in a natural habitat, it's it's just like a theoretical thing. It's just kind of like an idea. You're not actually seeing what it is. And I don't think I've really seen what turquoise is. So it makes sense. A lot of the conclusions that I will share with you, they make sense to me. And I have had occasions in my life where I think I've really seen turquoise very deeply, but at the end of the day, I actually do not know. Uh, and often I will describe turquoise in terms of contrasting it with yellow, and sometimes in a speculative way as well. So just keep that in mind. Like, please don't take what I'm saying here as this is turquoise and this is what it is, because we actually don't know. No one talking about turquoise really knows what turquoise really is. I've seen people talking on YouTube with a lot of certainty about what turquoise is. Fine, okay, they might be saying some things that are true, but I also think we need to be humble here and just realize that it's tough to know what turquoise is. Another warning with turquoise, and we're going to go into this more deeply later on, but I just want to say that it's people just they confuse turquoise with spirituality and like direct spiritual experiences. That's a complicated topic, and we're going to tease that apart as we go along here. But in general, if you're seeing someone who's had a spiritual experience or they're a spiritual teacher, and you notice that your first reaction is to want to say that they're turquoise, just just be careful. Just I would probably say they're probably not turquoise. You're probably, because again, it's so rare. And having spiritual experiences doesn't mean you're turquoise. It might make it more likely that you're turquoise. It might make it more likely that you will develop into turquoise consciousness, but it's not a guarantee. People have been having spiritual experiences for thousands of years. Are you telling me that they were all turquoise? I mean, think about the fact that stage green didn't even come on until the 1960s, 1970s in a widespread manner. And you're going to tell me that stage turquoise is, you know, all the people in the past who've had spiritual lives, spiritual experiences, who've been sages and whatever, we're tapping into turquoise. I don't think you're understanding the model, but we'll get to that. All right. Just warning you not to equate the two like naively. You have to like be more nuanced about it and really consider that this is a very rare thing. You're not really going to see turquoise very often, and just keep that in mind as we go along. So let me talk about my approach to turquoise. We're not going to talk about the characteristics just yet. I want to talk about my approach, my assumptions, because again, the theory is quite weak, to be honest. There's not a lot of agreement. With yellow, there's quite a lot of agreement that it's like a second tier, it's like the start of a new meta level. There's not quite the same agreement with turquoise. What I will assume is that it is a stage beyond yellow, right? So that means a few things. What you see in a lot of developmental models is that there are stages beyond yellow. So we're going to assume that there are stages beyond yellow. Um, and we're going to assume that if turquoise exists, it is one of those stages, right? Another implication of this is that if a person has turquoise in them, by definition, they've also experienced first tier and yellow. They've been through first tier and yellow. So if you've been through first tier and yellow, you might start to be tapping into turquoise, right? I mean, self-evaluation is a very is a very um, treacherous path because we're very apt to fooling ourselves because we think these levels are higher, and we think we're becoming enlightened and all of this. So we have to be careful with that. In other people, if you can't see first tier and yellow in them, I would be very careful about concluding that they have turquoise consciousness in them. Um, but we can say it is yellow and it is something else at the same time. So it includes yellow, it includes green, it includes orange, and it's something beyond that. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. In terms of tier, is it second tier? Is it another tier? Um, there's several difficulties here. I'm not going to make a firm conclusion on that because I don't think it actually matters. I mean, I suppose it can be nice to know, but I don't think we know enough to say really. Um, some models pin them in basically the same meta level or tier as yellow, like Spiral Dynamics. They say that yellow and turquoise are second tier levels. Graves did the same. He said that yellow and turquoise were the start of a new sort of meta level. He didn't say that, but that's basically what he was saying. Others pin it in a new meta level, like Suzanne Cook-Reuter. She actually her yellow analog is in one meta level, and then the level after yellow is in the next meta level. So really, she's putting yellow in the same meta level as green and orange, right? I think that's how she does it. But in any case, I know that she puts yellow and the one after yellow, whether you want to call it turquoise or not, let's call it turquoise for ease of communication, she puts it in a different tier to yellow. So that kind of throws a spanner in the works in terms of spiral dynamics, and even in terms of Ken Wilber's model. So what am I going to say? Right, I'm going to say that it is the stage that immediately precedes yellow. Sorry, it immediately comes after yellow. And there are further stages beyond yellow that are spiritual stages. Could turquoise be one of them? Ken Wilber doesn't think so, but Suzanne Cook-Reuter would imply that she thinks so. I actually think it's sort of like, I don't want to say it's a transitional phase. It could be a transitional phase. We might come to the conclusion that stage turquoise isn't actually a stage in its own right. A lot of researchers don't come to that conclusion. Um, what I will say is that it's beyond yellow, but it's not quite a fully spiritual stage of consciousness, right? So I don't think it's fully third tier. It doesn't belong in the stages like that are beyond second tier in Wilber's model. Are we going to call it second tier or third tier? I'm not. I don't think it really matters that much. I would rather know about the characteristics. It kind of depends on how do you slice up the developmental pie. We like to think of development as like stages, like this one and that one and that one and that one and that one. If we think of development more as like a continuum with no breaks in it, that's also a flawed model, but let's just think of it like that. Then turquoise is like a period that comes after yellow and that comes before true transpersonal development. So it's yellow here, there's a stage here, I think, and then there's true transpersonal development. The stage here after yellow, it might actually be a transitional stage. We might discover that this stage is transitional. I mean, it depends. How do you slice up the pie? And I'll leave that to the true theoreticians. I'm not really a theoretician. I'm not here doing the research. I'll leave it to them. But I keep that in mind. It's after yellow, and it's not a truly transpersonal stage, right? Another thing I want to say about my approach is that I've called this Spiral Dynamics Stage Turquoise. I've called the video Spiral Dynamics Stage Turquoise because this is what people search for. People want to know about Spiral Dynamics Stage Turquoise, and there's a lot of misinformation about it, I believe. But basically, one thing that Wilbur showed me is that all these stages of development, whether it's orange, green, yellow, or blue, or before that, they're not just spiral dynamics things. They appear in levels of development that are modeling things that spiral dynamics is not modeling, like faith, linguistic development, musical development, emotional development, cognitive development, and so on. There's many of them. So it's not just for spiral dynamics. I'm going to call it stage turquoise. So that kind of implies that I'm talking about spiral dynamics, but I'm talking about more than spiral dynamics. I'm talking about development as a whole across all areas. Spiral dynamics, in my mind, focuses on values, worldview, psychology. Three sort of areas of development that are related but not have their own sort of uses and characteristics and so on. So when I'm talking stage turquoise, I'm really talking about post yellow across all stages of development. A post yellow stage that is not quite fully transpersonal, but sort of starting to bridge that gap. But across not just spiral dynamics, all possible like stage models of development. Another thing I'm going to remind you of is that turquoise is extremely rare, and we need to factor that in as we're talking about it. I know I've said that. I just want to make that very clear, and as part of my approach is to assume that it's very rare. And I'm not even really going to give you any examples of turquoise because, again, I'm not sure I've even seen it, like in my personal life, but even like on the internet, it's very, very tentative here. Um, Yellow accounts for something like between 5 and 10% of people in developed countries, or that's a simplification. I don't think people are yellow, but let's just say it appears in 5 to 10% of people in developed countries. From what I've seen, the estimates out there, turquoise is no more than 1%, appears in no more than 1% of people. So we just have to really keep that in mind here. And my approach to turquoise, I'm also reminding everyone that this is a theoretical abstraction, which may or may not be useful. It may or may not be absolutely accurate. It may or may not be, totally rigorous. It may not be fully supported by research. Let's not take it too seriously. But also, a lot of the models I've studied are pointing to something beyond yellow and something that isn't a truly transpersonal stage yet. And that is what I think turquoise is. In any case, all of these staging, all these models and all these, yellow and second tier and whatever, we're just trying to map out the development which happens in people. And as a model, it might be starting to break down when we don't have the research, when we're starting to make assumptions, and when, it's sort of beyond our understanding at this point. All right, so now let's start to talk about the characteristics, and we're going to start in sort of a negative sense, talking about what turquoise is not, and that will help you understand what turquoise actually is. So, first off, I want to make it very clear that turquoise is not the start of spiritual development. What do I mean by this? Because what I basically see is that people equate turquoise to the beginning of one's spiritual life, or at least the beginning of one's true spiritual life, they might say, of actually directly experiencing spirit, right? We have to keep in mind that faith is always part of our lives. Even if we call ourselves atheists, materialists, scientists, we're still spiritual because we're still defining what is ultimately true and real in the ultimate sense. So, spiritual development is something we experience from very young. We're always looking for answers to what is ultimately true, as I just said. So, it's not the start of spiritual development. It's also not a state of consciousness. This is a really big mistake that people make. What I mean by it's not a state of consciousness is that it's not spiritual realization, it's not awakening, it's not enlightenment, it's not non duality. So we cannot equate the two. If you see a spiritual teacher talking about truths, teaching truths, making truth claims, and so on, it doesn't mean that they're turquoise. What it means is they've had state experiences, or they've grown in their state experience. They've maybe, they've seen beyond the surface of consciousness, and they're tapping into source levels of consciousness. But this can happen at orange, it can happen at green, it can happen at yellow, it can happen even down at blue. I'm not saying there is that is a complicated topic. I just do not equate the two, because they are not the same thing. And Ken Wilber has given a lot of like an in-depth explanation of this, and a lot of cogent arguments for why this is the case. So you have to realize that stage turquoise is a stage of development. It's not an experience. It is not meditation training or anything else. It is actually a stage of consciousness, and it precedes yellow, right? So if you, as I said to you before, if you're listening to like a teacher, or you're looking at yourself, or you're looking at someone else that you know, and you're not seeing yellow, like you're not seeing the evolutionary view, you're not seeing like um, post green judgment, you're not seeing sort of all the other common yellow traits, you're not seeing multi perspectivalness, for example, you're probably not going to see turquoise either. So you have to look. If you're listening to an enlightened teacher, for example, don't just look at the spiritual claims they're making. Look at how they are sort of, how are they framing them? How are they interpreting them? How are they communicating them? What's the worldview there? What are their values? What is their sort of their sense of self? What are the hidden maps that are guiding all their interpretation, their communication, and so on of these states? You might discover that, okay, they're actually probably operating from yellow or even above yellow. You might a lot of them are operating from green. A lot of modern spiritual teachers are operating from green in terms of their psychological development. They might have had non-dual experiences. They might be quite well established in the higher states of consciousness, in source level consciousness, but they might be green. A lot of them are, or they might be yellow, or they might be something else, right? So I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm just saying don't equate the two, because they're not really the same thing. I will say, as a counter argument to my own argument, is that Terry O'Fallon, who's a researcher in like structures of consciousness, stages of consciousness, quite similar to Ken Wilber, but comes to different conclusions. She argues that yellow has a different state experience to her post-yellow stage. In other words, let's say that yellow has a different state experience to turquoise. In other words, if you're yellow, you're going to have a different spiritual life in terms of your direct perception of spirit than turquoise will, right? So there might be a correlation here, but I really warn you against just equating people that seem enlightened with turquoise, because again, it's so rare. It's really very, very rare. A little thing that you can use to differentiate turquoise from like a state, or like a direct experience, or like direct consciousness of God or whatever, is that stages are permanent structures that are chronological. You develop through them over the course of your life. States constitute sort of the fabric of your direct experience, rather than how you are interpreting it, how you're communicating it, how you're understanding it, how that fits in with your worldview, and so on. Stages are culturally bound. That's why we talk about like an entire society being predominantly orange, or predominantly blue, or predominantly red, or a group of people being green, or whatever, because it's culturally bound. Why am I saying that? Because states are not so culturally bound. We can see non-dual states being talked about since, if we assume that Jesus and Buddha existed, in the time of Buddha and Jesus, right? Um, I do not think they were turquoise because the societies and cultures that they were living in were probably like purple, red, blue at best, right? And developing even into orange or green or yellow, you do not have the cultural surround. You do not, it's almost like you do not have a need to develop into higher stages that are way beyond where your culture and where your society and where the people around you are at. Whereas states are not quite like that. States are given, as Wilbur would say, states are given and stages are earned. You also cannot skip stages. You can kind of skip states. You know, you might have sudden experiences of like a non-dual state or a witnessing state. Stages, it tends to be a more chronological thing. And actually, the very fabric of one stage is built on the fabric of the previous one. So those are some things to keep in mind. And I said, I don't have all the answers. There's debate about this. It could be that turquoise is a stage, yes, but it also opens you, it has a different state structure. I think there's a lot we don't know about this stuff. I just want to warn you, do not equate spirituality and enlightened teachers and all of this with turquoise because you're making a very gross simplification. You're also forgetting about stages beyond turquoise, which might be uh, people might be there. The people you're listening to might be there. They might not be. They might be more orange, green, yellow. I just think it's very tempting to want. Oh well, we understand everything up to yellow, and everything else that seems like a bit beyond yellow, or it seems not to like fall into the framework. We'll just chunk it all into stage turquoise, and I see it happening all the time. Uh, Theoretically, it's a problem. In your personal life, it can be a problem. And it can just get you looking in the wrong places about where you're going to develop to as a human being. So, um, yeah, just be more nuanced about it and read more, and you'll realize that it's not quite as simple as that. All right, so I did promise we're going to talk about the characteristics of stage turquoise, and now we are going to talk about them. So, thanks for your patience. If you thought any of that was superfluous, I do apologize, but I put it all in there because I really want you to understand it. It's a difficult subject to talk about. We don't really know. Our conclusions are tentative and so on. However, I'm going to present you with quite a lot of information here about the characteristics of turquoise that I am fairly sure we can conclude. And I've explained why, and I'll explain more why I'm sure we can conclude these things, right? One thing we can conclude about turquoise is that it has to be in a just self stage. Spiral Dynamics, basically, the model says that we oscillate between express self and a just self, between sort of imposing ourselves on the world and adjusting ourselves to the world. Green is express self, sorry, green is a just self, yellow is express self, turquoise, if it exists, must be in a just self stage. Once you realize that, you can start to kind of get a better feeling for what it is. It has to have a very different feeling to yellow does then, if it's an adjust self. I think we can also conclude because it's an adjust self stage that, like the other adjust self stages, it has a more feminine feel, it has a more communal bend, it has a more body centered approach. It's more right brained than yellow is, it's more receptive than yellow is. I think what I've found from the research, and I'm going to talk about specific research that I have found, is that turquoise is a deconstructive stage, similar to stage green. You know, I know stage green does bring new truths to our lives, right? New truths in terms of like multiculturalism, about sensitivity, about justice, about egalitarianism. But green is also a very deconstructive stage, and you'll know that if you've been through green, that it feels like the carpet is being pulled out from under your feet a little bit because all your rationalism, all your like scientism, all your certainty in the scientific model, all your certainty in like physicality, the physicality of the world, all your achiever drives, all your ideas of money and success and prestige and recognition is going to make you happy. All this, all your motivations about standing out and being better than other people, all you're buying into like traditional notions of success and what it means to be successful in life, all of that gets pulled under your from your feet, and so it can be very deconstructive, and it can feel like you're sort of left in a heap. And I think we have to sort of say that turquoise is the same, and I have research to back this up. And it's coming after yellow, which is yellow is a very constructive stage in the sense that we are now seeing evolution. We are now seeing multi-perspectivalism. We're no longer just relativists that just like equate everything like we do at green. We're actually there's like a new synthesis happening at yellow. I think at turquoise we're starting to even realize that that is limiting, and so it can be very deconstructive. I think we have to make that conclusion. And this is good, realizing that it's an adjust self stage, it's a deconstructive stage, it's more right brain, more communal, body centered, more receptive. I think that's useful for identifying it in yourself. What I've also concluded is that it's a juncture between sort of personal stages of consciousness, which includes everything up to yellow. Like, I know yellow, once we get to green, you are starting to undo that a little bit, but fundamentally, green and yellow and all the stages before it are fundamentally about either building up a self or sort of perpetuating that self. What I think turquoise is, it's a sort of a transitional phase between that, or a juncture. Not saying that turquoise necessarily has to be a transitional phase, but in terms of it, the overall movement of development, we can see it as a transition between those sort of personalized, personal stages of consciousness and the actual quintessential post-personal stages of consciousness, which is one of the reasons why it exhibits a lot of the characteristics it does, and why it's a deconstructive stage, and so on. While I am not going to equate stage turquoise to enlightenment, I think we can quite confidently conclude that in turquoise, spiritual enlightenment, direct glimpses, direct experience of the divine, direct experience of source, transcendence of our surface mind, surface body, surface consciousness is becoming much more available, because it's, in terms of like stage development, in terms of like chronological development, in terms of like our psychology, transpersonal development is just over our head. It's just, it's just a little bit further down. So you're starting to realize the limits of personal consciousness, and you're probably now wondering, well, what's next? So it's like, in terms of like the stage development part, you're already starting to see it. And actually, what I found is that most people who get to even like green and yellow are already experimenting with spirituality. They might be doing it in ways that don't really get to the heart of the matter, especially at green, fine. But I think you've already probably come across it. It just seems to be the tide of development. That by the time we get to green, yellow, you're going to have experimented with spirituality that is not just like religion and belief and fundamentalism, but actually starting to move into like spiritual transmission, transformation, transfiguration, direct experience, and so on. So we can make that conclusion that spirituality is definitely becoming more available. And by spirituality, I mean actual direct consciousness of these matters. Another thing that I've found is common to many models is that at turquoise, we really fully integrate first tier. We do this in our personal lives, we really integrate. So at yellow, we can sort of see all of first tier in ourselves, but at turquoise, we really feel it, we really embody it, and it's It's like we truly embrace it and we truly live it very deeply. We have much less allergy to it in ourselves. We also have, we can see it more clearly in other people, and we actually love it more in other people. I'm going to come back to this point, but what I found at turquoise, there's much less allergy to first tier. At yellow, especially if you learn these maps, it's like you can see the systems of consciousness working in people, but you can still be quite judgmental about it. And I think that's because you're still sort of pushing against them in your own development. You're pushing against them so that you can move further, right? I think at turquoise, there's actually, you're done with the pushing away and you're actually really integrating it now. And you're really like appreciating why it's there. We're going to come back to that in a minute. So, in terms of specific research into turquoise, I want to talk about Claire Graves' research. He called turquoise, he didn't call it turquoise, but his work led to spiral dynamics in many ways. And he did discover a stage beyond yellow. He called it B-O-. If you're ever looking at Graves' work, this is what it's called. And it's very different to yellow. He actually discovered in his studies, like he tracked people over time, he tracked how they were thinking over time, how their worldview changed, and so on. And what he basically found is that a few of the yellow people that he'd identified in his studies, they started thinking in a way that is beyond yellow. It's like qualitatively different to yellow. So if we conclude that their thinking is only one sort of step beyond yellow, we could say that he identified turquoise. He himself, I just want to reiterate this, Graves himself was very clear that he did not have a lot of data and his conclusions were very tentative, right? So just bear that in mind. Claire Graves called this an adjust self stage, which he kind of had to because his model depends on that. But also, I think some of his conclusions lend to that. He said that turquoise is about adjusting, quote, to the realities of one's existent, end quote, existence, I mean to say. So whereas at blue, we adjust ourselves to authority, at green, we adjust ourselves to group, the group we want to fit in with and please and get on with and generate good feelings with and so on. Turquoise is not about that. It's adjusting to reality, about the realities of life. He said that there is a reliance on being and feeling. He called it, quote, experientialistic, impressionistic, intuitive, end quote. A characteristic of turquoise that he really underlined in his work is that turquoise realizes that it doesn't know very much. Even after coming through yellow and after all like the map making and knowledge gathering in yellow, it realizes it actually doesn't know very much. He said that at turquoise, quote, we sacrifice the idea that one will ever know what it is all about, end quote. I want to read a couple of longer quotes from Graves about turquoise because I think this really, it's quite poetic and I think it really nicely, concisely summarizes what he thought about turquoise, which again, there wasn't much, but in his book, The Never-Ending Quest, there's a decent amount of material. Okay, Graves says, quote, he values wonder, awe, reverence, humility, fusion, integration, unity, simplicity, the poetic perception of reality, non-interfering perception versus active controlling perception, enlarging consciousness, and the ineffable experience, end quote. So a lot of this fits with what I've said about it being beyond yellow, sort of deconstructive. He also says something else that's really interesting. Quote, he does not value adjusting to the world, as authority says it is, nor does he value the imposition of his self upon the world. What he values is adjusting to the world as he senses it to be, end quote. So there's a lot I could say about that. However, what I want to do now is go on to Suzanne Cook-Reuter, who, as I said, I think she's got the most complete and most reliable research and conclusions about turquoise. So I want to talk about her, and you'll realize there's a lot of crossover between what she says and what Graves said. Um, if you're looking at Suzanne Cook-Reuter's work, and I would really recommend you read her paper called The Nine Levels. Search The Nine Levels, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, you'll probably find it. It's a free PDF. It's like available on the internet for free, not as an illegal thing, but as a thing that she's distributed. She calls it construct aware or ego aware. This is her post yellow stage. She doesn't use colors, but she identifies one of her stages as being the analog of yellow, and then the one that is beyond that is called construct aware or ego aware, and that's what I think her analog of turquoise is, right? So she has it as an actual stage of development, like at a stage, not just a transitional phase, an actual stage. And even though it seems deconstructive and uncertain, and as though it's just clearing the decks, it's not really bringing anything new in, sort of clearing the decks from all previous development. She has it as a stage. So I think that's an interesting to note. What does she mean by construct aware? She basically means that at turquoise, we realize that meaning is constructed. What does she mean by ego aware? She means that we realize that self identity is a construct. So, as I said, it's a very deconstructive phase, and she literally uses the word construct in her maps, in her model. So it's a very deconstructive phase. So this is why I say it's not strictly transpersonal, because we're realizing that meaning and self-identity are a construct. It's an excellent insight, but what's replacing that then? And I don't think at turquoise we're really replacing it with anything. It's really we're replacing it with not knowing. Like we're replacing it with an absence rather than anything that's actually like a new thing. So it's definitely a deconstructive thing. But notice right here that at yellow, and I don't know if you've been through yellow. If you have, you can come to your own conclusions. But from what I know of yellow in my own life, is that at yellow we seem to like be very certain about a lot of things, even if we admit they're complicated. We sort of still rely on knowledge a lot. We rely on meaning. We rely on ourselves to somehow figure everything out. Eventually we'll figure it out. If we just read enough books, we read enough theories about psychology and history and culture and all of this, we'll eventually figure it all out, right? At turquoise, it's kind of like the polar opposite. Suzanne Cook-Reuter says we realize that all knowledge and language is really an abstraction. That's a remarkable insight to have, given the yellow stage, where even though we're understanding that, say, rationality isn't the only thing, sensitivity isn't the only thing, literal truth isn't the only thing, somehow we think that if we synthesize it all enough, we're going to get somewhere. Turquoise, we're basically realizing that isn't going to happen. It's a remarkable jump, some remarkable thing to realize. And this goes beyond just like a green deconstruction and relativism, because green is still very adamant that, say, Eastern maps of reality are more true, or non-rational maps of reality, or um, and it's very also attached to this idea of non-rationality. It's very attached to this idea of not conceptualizing too much. Whereas turquoise is seeing that all meaning making and all knowledge and all language is an abstraction. So it's like another step beyond the deconstructive, like the epistemological deconstruction. I hope I said that right. Of green, it's like another step beyond that. Cook-Reuter says that we realize that map making is a human need. So that's, again, just in very stark contrast to yellow. And again, this seems like very good evidence that there is stages of development beyond yellow that aren't actually fully transpersonal, but they are definitely different to yellow, like fundamentally different. We're seeing that map making is a human need. If you've read any maps from like sort of yellow type knowledge maps, like Ken Wilber's integral theory, it seems like they're very adamant that the map is real and that it's not just a human need, it's actually a real thing. And this is a very different thing. It's realizing that it's just a human need. It's like where the intellect is really just serving our human need for meaning and purpose and like solidity and understanding and like figuring it all out. Isn't that remarkable? You have to wonder, well, if we realize that all language and knowledge and maps and meaning and self identity is really a construction, what's left? Cook says that turquoise understands the ground of being, like it understands spirituality, it understands source consciousness, it understands what is beyond just the contents of our awareness, it understands what is beyond our usual experience, but it doesn't actually fully embody it yet. I couldn't think of a greater evidence that there's something beyond yellow that isn't fully transpersonal. And this to me points that there is a turquoise. There is like another second tier level, excuse me, that is beyond yellow, but it's not quite fully transpersonal. Excuse me. There's a new self concept that arises at turquoise. What Cook says is that basically we give up our search for this enduring identity, for our authentic self, for who we really are, for even the idea that we are this body, we are this mind. We start to give that up. And instead our identity becomes fluid. It becomes open. It becomes more of a process rather than a thing. And this is a very spiritual realization to have. This is the sort of realizations that are present in a lot of the contemplative traditions. So in this sense, as I said, it's starting to penetrate into actual like permanent spiritual awareness as an identity and not just as like an experience, right? Cook is very adamant that this stage has an all-pervasive uncertainty, and she uses these words, all-pervasive uncertainty around it. It's like, so it is very deconstructive, and it's, as I said, it's clearing the decks, I think, for real transpersonal consciousness. But notice it's also very different to yellow, right? It's so different. As I said, at yellow, we're really adamant. We're not so adamant about rationality as we were in like rational orange consciousness, but we're adamant that somehow we can figure everything out with our maps and our theories, right? Okay, and now I'd like to share some of the conclusions that I've heard from a woman called Nomali Pereira, who is an integral coach, practitioner. She has been involved with sort of the integral community for many years. And I've this comes from a talk that I listened to first like a few years ago, and I went to find it on YouTube again and I couldn't find it. I did eventually find it on another platform. For some reason, it's not on YouTube anymore. So if you know what I'm talking about, I'd like to know why it's not on YouTube. I think it's a great resource. But anyway, she gives a lot of pointers, and I feel like they align with the other research I've done. And I tend to trust what she says, even if they're based on her personal experience of turquoise. I really tend to trust what she says. So let's see. She basically says that, and a lot of this I'm just paraphrasing, but I'm sort of condensing and paraphrasing and so on. She says that at turquoise we still see the stages of development like yellow does. However, now we actually truly appreciate why they exist. We understand the cultural and social background for these value systems. We also understand that people will inhabit them. We're not just trying to like imagine the world moving up to second tier. where we understand that the world will not do that. I mean, it might over time, but overnight, that's not going to happen. Um, and we actually love all the stages of development. Yellow, we actually are quite judgmental. We might not realize it. We might think we're not being judgmental, but often, I have to be honest, I realize that yellow can be very judgmental, and I've seen it myself. Um, it's like we understand the value systems, and we might have read about the value systems. Hell, I've read how many models about these things, but is we still don't actually get it. Like, we don't get why there are so many competing worldviews. We don't understand why our people are at different levels of development. At Turquoise, we actually get it now. We deeply get it. And Nomali says that this brings on a certain heartbreak for the world. We're not just sort of analyzing the world and analyzing the levels of consciousness in people. It's almost like we can feel it. It's like there's a resonance there. It's like we understand where they're coming from. And because of that, there's more of like an emotional understanding and even a heartbreak, looking out at the problems of the world and seeing these stages of development causing chaos a lot of the time, as we all know they do. It actually becomes a heartbreak. It's not like we're just intellectually like categorizing and judging and filing them away. We actually get it now, and so we see why these things happen, and it actually becomes more of a heartbreak than anything else. At the same time, she says that we trust in emergence more. Emergence meaning evolution, change, the pattern of things in the world. We trust in that more than we do at Yale, because we're starting to connect with the the grand reason for all of this, not like the human reason for it all, the grand reason for it all. Um, there's a deeper trust, and we're not just like, and that sort of explains why we're not like judging and filing away and putting ourselves above people. We trust in evolution more. We no longer put yellow or integral or higher stages of development on a pedestal like we used to. I don't know about you, but at Yale, I've made this mistake a lot. Is like thinking that somehow higher has to be better. There's a lot of theoreticians that think that is true, and I think generally it is true. I mean, things are getting better over time in all dimensions, but this naive equating of higher equals better, therefore we must get everyone higher, is really kind of a yellow thing. And Nomali is very certain that at Turquoise we drop that, and we just relax a bit and just be like, everyone is where they're at. I am also where I am at. I've been where I was, and let's just trust that things will move along in, like, they will take their course and things will improve naturally. We drop the maps and scholarship, and we enter the territory of body, mind, psyche, the present, the unseen. We actually embody the direct experience of being alive rather than like mapping it all out, studying it all, and accumulating knowledge and all these theories and so on. We also don't try to uphold an image of being highly developed, because again, we're not so obsessed with higher being better now. And so even the idea of us being higher as being better is starting to fall away. And this, it makes sense because, as Graves and Kreuter said, our self sense is starting to fall away now as like a permanent reality. So it makes sense that we're not trying to uphold this image of being like this highly developed, like integral yellow, all inclusive, multi perspectival person. We just are. We just behave as we are, right? Turquoise is okay with not knowing. The theme of not knowing once again comes up. So we have to conclude that post yellow, the post yellow stage, the stage, that immediately comes after yellow, there's a big sort of deconstructing of knowledge and of epistemology and of what we think is true. We're actually okay with not knowing. Whereas at yellow and other previous stages, we really want to know. We really want to like figure it all out somehow. And we think that we will eventually figure it out. We're actually okay with not knowing. And I think this is a good marker of turquoise in yourself and in other people. How okay with not knowing are you, and how okay with not knowing is someone else? And at turquoise, there's a sort of feeling sense that comes on that Nomali identifies. She talks about in terms of like surrendering, of breathing out, of relaxing, of being more lucid. It's like we're much more in the present now, not just like lost in the head as yellow tends to be. And this it, it matches nicely what Cook, Reuter, and Graves says. So yellow has a different feeling tone, a different internal experience than turquoise does. Um, and I think this has a translation into our behavior, in our demeanor, whereas turquoise is much softer and it's much more sort of receptive and open, and it just doesn't know. It's not making firm conclusions. Even if like yellow comes to like very complex, nuanced, seemingly all inclusive conclusions. At turquoise, we're just like, nah, let's just, it doesn't even matter what we say, like, because who knows? Like, what is language? What is meaning? What is self? What is life? What is this all about? Turquoise is open to that, and it just lets go a bit. It just lets go of all the intellectualizing, lets go of the being sort of centered in the head, of being contracted around the intellect, and so on. Before we talk about how to see turquoise in yourself and others, I want to talk a little bit about what I think turquoise is, um, in my own personal experience. And I do, in some ways, see myself tapping into turquoise, and I can see that where my yellow is starting to break down. I don't want to make any strong claims about that. I mean, I don't actually, I'm not sure, and I don't think it's really relevant. What I will say is that I've had like glimpses where I was pretty certain, for brief moments, that I could see very clearly what post yellow is. And one of the things that I've felt was this lucidity and all of my yellow knowledge being sort of recapitulated into like a deep embodied understanding of the greater dynamics that are going on around us. And I find it very hard to describe it. But the trust in emergence, the trust in evolution, the trust in things are unfolding as they should be, even if on the surface that might not appear to be the case often, that was very evident to me in those moments. It was also very evident that just how much the earlier stages are in me, and how much I need to embody them, and how much I cannot just throw them away and intellectually judge them. And actually, the only reason I am who I am is because of all these stages of development. There is no Ross as I know it to be. There is no my life as I know it to be without the stages of development. And all of them, I mean all of them. I don't mean as in like getting to the higher ones. I mean the entire spectrum. I could actually feel the entire spectrum in my body. Um, I could feel like my beigeness. I could feel my purpleness. I could feel my redness. I could feel blue. I could feel all of the levels inside me. They were like totally activated, totally alive. And I'd never, even in all my studying and all my map making, all my endless, talking about these subjects, it didn't compare to that insight that I had at the time. So I've experienced of turquoise very much corroborates this, and I've noticed in recent times that I don't really care about stages of development so much. Like when I look at myself and when I look at other people, I can see the stages of development if I want to see them. But I also just, I'm looking at the person and I'm looking at what do they need right now. And I say this, I'm talking about this in like my classes, in my coaching, and in my personal life as well. I just see the person as they are, and I realize, okay, the things that they're looking for are maybe kind of flawed. They've maybe got a lot of flawed assumptions. The stages of development they're inhabiting have their own inherent flaws and blind spots. But it's just like, I'm not like wanting them to change. And I think before I've always wanted that. Even at like what I may consider a strong yellow phase, if I make a very tentative assumption that I might be pushing beyond yellow, I think I really like, I was like, okay, I understand all these stages, but I still want to get everyone up as high as possible, right? Um, I'm dropping that now, and also see my spiritual life is becoming very deep over, like even month by month, year by year. And again, I don't want to mistake that for turquoise, but I can see that I'm not really bothered so much about the maps and the theory and all of that, right? So I don't know if you see this in me and my podcast and how I teach and so on. If you see this when you're working with me, well, that's interesting. It might. I don't want to say I'm turquoise. I think that's a very flawed understanding of human development, and I don't know. And it sounds arrogant. And actually, it doesn't. I don't even really care that much. I just want to say that this stuff that I've read about turquoise, it makes sense to me, and it makes sense that it comes after yellow. All right, so I just want to leave you here with a little bit of a field guide. How do you see turquoise in yourself and others? This is just very brief points right here. Um, First of all, I think you have to look for first tier and yellow as being somewhat active. Stages of development do not leave us, right? It's not like we just go through them, or we wear them for a few years and then toss them out like clothes. They live on inside us. It's like they accumulate within us. They build up one on top of the other. I know that's like a cliche in the world of spiral dynamics, but like really appreciate that when you're looking for turquoise in yourself and other people. If you're not seeing some of the core elements of yellow, some of the core elements of green, some of the core elements of orange, and so on, all the way down, you're not going to see turquoise, because turquoise comes after yellow, and you cannot download turquoise, as the theory says, you cannot download turquoise after, unless you've downloaded yellow to a very significant degree. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind that turquoise is not just spirituality. Stop equating turquoise with spirituality. It's much more complicated than that. Human development is more complicated than that. However, also remember that spiritual teachers of all of us are probably more likely to embody turquoise than anyone else, right? So, yeah, use the theory and be wise, but there is some sort of relationship between the two. Look for qualities that seem to go beyond yellow. The not knowing, the deep trust, the deep appreciation of all people wherever they are in their development. The sort of a connection to post knowledge, post concepts, a deep questioning of our maps and our theories and language. Look for all these characteristics. Look for all the characteristics that I've talked about here. Obviously, do it with a skeptical eye. This is, again, it's very tentative conclusions that we're coming to, but you'll hopefully see that there is a lot of crossover here. And I'll just remind you, when you're looking for turquoise, if people start making claims to truth, like spiritual claims to truth, look at the language it's couched in, look at their psychology, look at their sort of assumptions, their framework, the maps that they're using to understand the world and themselves, and see if it actually matches turquoise. If it doesn't, you're probably not seeing turquoise. I'm not saying that what they're saying isn't important, but often what we do is we just say, oh, well, that person's a spiritual teacher, therefore they are turquoise, therefore they're highly developed and I should listen to everything they say. It's a trap. It's a big trap for many reasons, not notwithstanding the problem with identifying turquoise in the first place. So keep all of that in mind. All right, I hope this was a very informative and comprehensive to the extent that we can be comprehensive about Stage Turquoise. I hope this was an interesting and comprehensive presentation of Stage Turquoise. If you have anything to contribute, please write in the comments section. If you have any questions, if you want to refute anything I say, I'm really open because turquoise is difficult for the reasons I've um, proposed here, and I want to learn more and I want to understand and sense what turquoise is more deeply. All right. So yeah, thanks a lot for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe. Do support me on Patreon if you like what I do, and I will see you for more next week. Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, please leave a review. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at ross@deep-psychology.com. If you'd like to go deeper, head to deep-psychology.com for articles, courses, ebooks, and one-to-one coaching. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.